This is Polyamory Weekly, tales from the front of responsible non-monogamy from a pansexual, kink-friendly point of view. A warning for our under-18 listeners. This is an adult-oriented podcast about really lascivious things, like communication and honesty in relationships. If you're under 18 and looking for upfront advice and answers to questions about sex, please visit scarletteen.com.
This is Polyamory Weekly, episode 530 for September 7th, 2017. Coming up on today's show, what are the real political struggles of polyamory? It's on today's show. Hello, everyone. I am your host, Minx, and we have two fabulous co-hosts today, starting with LustyGuy.
Hello, everybody. Happy to be here as always.
And Kevin Patterson of Poly Role Models. Welcome, Kevin.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
Awesome. So glad you could be here. So we have a really fun topic today, at least fun for you guys. I'm probably going to sit back and let you guys expound because I'm not that political. But first, a quick announcement. Did you see that Poly Weekly got written up in IndieWire as one of the top 8 sex podcasts to listen to?
I actually did see that.
I did not see that until this morning, and it was pretty cool.
It's pretty cool. So we're right up there with Dan Savage and Tina Horn and sex nerd Sandra. And the first one they listed I'd never heard of, My Dad Wrote a Porno.
I heard about that recently. I haven't given it a listen, but this kind of makes me want to give it a shot.
You know, actually, my 4th grade music teacher wrote the script. He told us about this movie. He's like, yeah, I wrote this kind of funky little independent movie. I'm really waiting for it to get out there.
Independent movie.
That's what I remember he said independent. I was in 4th grade, but little movie. It's called Beyond the Green Door, he said.
Oh, wow.
In 4th grade. Yeah, exactly. Now, you know.
Wait, what?
That's right. I to this day, right, all I remember is him saying that. I had no idea at the time of what it was, but I think about 6 months later, I was looking through, or a year later or something, I was looking through some porn that I had found and saw an advertisement for the Behind the Green Door movie. And I was like, oh my God, did Mr. Dole really write that?
And you know what I like about this list? Getting back to the topic. There's some that I hadn't heard of, so I'm adding to my list, but there's one called Food for Thought. I like that the hosts are multiracial and queer. So, you know, there's a little bit of diversity in our podcast listening.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. And the thing that I thought was, so they did a brief write-up on Poly Weekly, which was very sweet and very kind. And there was one mistake. We haven't been podcasting since 2010. It was since 2005. The author, who is Jude Dry, the articles in IndieWire, said Minx answers listener questions with an almost maternal care, which I thought was very nice because nobody's ever described me as maternal. I don't have kids. So I thought that was nice. Our topic this week is a listener question. This is from AJ, who asked for the pronouns they and them. And it's a little long, but AJ says, I'm always a little taken aback by the types of news and stories that are considered progress for the poly community. Often these snippets involve corporations recognizing the poly community as a profitable market, inclusion of the poly community into the legal system, and the wholesale normalization of poly love and relationships. I have to ask, what is the purpose of this quote-unquote progress? As a member of the queer community, I find the greatest power of resistance, pleasure, and beauty not in the LGBTQ community's potential to assimilate into normalcy, but instead in its potential to disrupt normalcy itself. An ongoing conversation in the queer community is whether media recognition, corporate sponsorship, and marriage laws should really be the goals of queer organizing and activism. Basically, do we really want inclusion to the system that we already have? They talk about the milestone of legalization of same-sex marriage by the Supreme Court, saying this was supposed to be a milestone for the LGBTQ community, while white supremacy, police brutality, hate crimes, and other acts of violence go unchallenged. I would argue a little bit with that. I don't think they're completely unchallenged. But in the end, AJ is basically asking, what are the real political struggles for the poly community today? What kind of introspection is being done surrounding these struggles? What can the poly community learn from anti-racist and LGBTQ resistance movements? What is the radical potential of poly loving beyond becoming just normal?
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, dun, dun.
I've got a lot of thoughts here.
Yeah, I got one or two myself. But please, Kevin, go ahead.
I'm just going to sit back and sip my drink and let you guys chat. All right, Kevin, shoot.
What they said, what AJ said about assimilation into normalcy. I think about that all of the time. I'm not a big fan of respectability politics, which by way I mean assimilating to some normal standards so that we can get recognition and approval from a privileged majority. I'm not a big fan of that, which is why like my own work is all about sort of disrupting the narrative of cis het white guy in a closed triad with cis bi white women, traditionally attractive, well-to-do. So yeah, I like the idea of disrupting that narrative. I'm not exactly sure where we would go from a political standpoint, but for me, the activism around polyamory shouldn't be from a political standpoint. It should be from more of a interpersonal standpoint. I'm not at all interested in getting, 3 people married, and that's somebody's fight, and I don't mean to invalidate that at all, but that's not an interest of mine. What's an interest of mine is making monogamy not so much of a default setting, making ethical non-monogamy, consensual non-monogamy, polyamory, relationship anarchy part of a conversation between 2 people who are deciding what kind of relationship they want to have amongst themselves. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the whole multiple marriage, I don't know what it's called as a movement. It's sort of a luxury struggle. I don't have other concerns. I'm not worried about police brutality as an aspect of my life. I'm not worried about Islamophobia, transphobia as a central aspect of my life. So I can fight for this luxury struggle. I can fight for this 3-person marriage. And again, I don't want to invalidate it, but it's not like an interest of mine at all.
I'm going to underscore that desire not to invalidate anybody else's activism. If somebody else sees something that calls to them that they see as an injustice and they want to engage on that topic, honestly, for your ability to engage, you have nothing but my support. I'm a real believer in the notion of the marketplace of ideas being crowded and full of people who have passion trying to advocate their idea. And I'm not going to say that this struggle is harder or worse than that struggle. I am going to say that the poly movement has to be extraordinarily careful in its introspection and comparison with the movements that have been faced by the lesbian and gay community and racial minorities of all stripes here in America. There is no poly Matthew Shepard. I say this all the time. There is no poly Tamir Rice. There is no history of 400 years of night riders coming to poly homes and lighting crosses on fire in their yards. We don't have thousands of poly lynchings. It's not the same. And I think that needs to be remembered oftentimes for, again, as much as you say, I don't want to invalidate anybody else's activism. And I probably wouldn't actually use the term luxury struggle, although I get what you mean.
I made a little note, luxury struggle. That actually resonates a bit with me.
It does. I totally get what you mean. But on the other hand, I wouldn't use that term and I wouldn't say that to somebody. But at the same time, I would challenge somebody if they tried to equate their desire for, let's say, 3-person marriage with the attempt to end Jim Crow. They're not the same. And we have to be very careful in making those comparisons. If the question is, what are the actual political struggles of the poly community? My answer is there really aren't any. There are lots of individual struggles. Now, if you have lost your job because your boss found out that you have more than one partner, if you have found yourself wrapped up in a custody case because an ex is using your polyamory against you, you certainly are engaged in a struggle and you have my support. But those struggles do not compare to the 1 in 3 black men that are in jail in America right now. That's not happening to an isolated individual black man in the U.S. That's happening to everybody. And there is no everybody in the poly community.
Yeah, there's no systemic oppression. There's no school to prison pipeline for polyamory, you know?
No. Polyamorous people have never had their children taken away and forced to learn a different language and not pay attention to their parents' culture. The list just goes on and on and on. And I think that in the poly community, such as it is, we have to be extraordinarily careful when we talk about the actual efforts to get equal protection under the law, which are legit. Again, those examples that I gave do happen sometimes. Do not get equated with a battle against the Night Riders, right? It's just not the same.
And there's a general problem when it comes to politics. A lot of time, like identity politics, is just an ignorance of other people's identities front and back. And I feel like if we create inclusive polyamorous communities, we get to lean into a lot of people's cultures just by way of social connection, and I'm just thinking about it in terms of my own relationships, where I learned a lot more about the struggle of mentally ill people just by way of partners. I understand fat shaming and body shaming better. I understand Islamophobia better. I understand LGBT struggles better. All things that I don't have any lived experience with, just by being in proximity to people who have these same struggles. And if we're doing that sort of globally, outside of just our individual relationships, but with the help of like our entire communities, we get to understand these things better. So instead of trying to equate a polyamorous struggle with, say, a racial struggle, you get to understand that racial struggle better. And then it strengthens our polyamorous communities by feeding it backwards, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. I think association with people from different walks of life always provides an opportunity for opening one's mind a little bit. I think it was Twain that said that travel was the antidote for ignorance or something. I'm not quite sure. It may have been ignorance, but that was the germ of the point there, that by meeting new people from different cultures, you can address your own lack of awareness. We don't know what we don't know. And as we know more and learn more, I absolutely agree that goes great strides towards reducing oppression and bigotry. It is hard, as studies have been shown to see, when you know people who are out, it is harder to hold bigoted attitudes towards the group they're out from, right? When you know gays, when gays have come out and said, I'm gay, and they're friends, it is harder to hold negative anti-gay opinions.
You can't demonize your buddy in the same way.
Exactly.
FYI, the actual quote is, "Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime." Mark Twain.
Indeed.
Absolutely.
I would like to circle back to one of the earlier questions that the reader asked, AJ, which is to say, what is the purpose of this progress? Where some of those examples of progress included being marketed at, being included in the legal system, and the wholesale normalization of poly-loving relationships. Now, 1/3 of that, the purpose of being included as a profitable market, in American culture, we think you haven't arrived until you've had your 15 minutes of fame or until somebody's trying to sell to you.
Yeah.
And really,
that's true. Yeah.
that's what that sees. And I can see that as, arguable. Maybe it really doesn't mean you've arrived. Maybe you're just buying into a system of consumerism. But on the next two, I'm going to push back a little bit. The inclusion into the legal system is, in fact, a necessary and valuable goal in and of itself. I have had friends who have been unable to visit family and love members while they died in the hospital because they were not part of the legal system and their relationships were not recognized. Post gay marriage, same-sex marriage.
Marriage equality.
Marriage equality. Thank you.
Marriage equality.
I have had friends who would not have otherwise been able to say goodbye to their dying family members, say goodbye. That is a value in and of itself. As polyamorous love becomes normalized, it will be a more rare target for the bullies in our culture that go for the things that are different. Those two layers of progress are worthwhile goals in and of themselves and should not be dismissed and put in the same notion of, do you really think you're here just because you're being sold to? I get you on that one. We probably make it mean more than it should, But inclusion in the legal system and a little bit of cover fire from bullies are both valuable things in and of themselves, I think.
Yeah. It's sort of a moving target. And don't get me wrong. I'm agreeing. I agree 100%. Like I've got a partner who has three different partners. And if she's ever sick, the hospital will say that she is single, and none of us partners have any valid recourse in terms of like her health, even like visitation rights or anything like that. But it ends up being a little bit of a moving target when we talk about, say, 3-person marriage. And what about 4-person marriage? What about polyamorous who aren't interested in being married, or we have too many partners spread out in too many places or something to that effect, where my polyamory is pretty loosey-goosey. I don't know who I get married to in this situation other than the wife that I married already. The idea of inclusion into a legal system, a lot of rewriting would have to be done to that legal system. And that's something that the writer already said. Like, do we desire inclusion into the system? We would have to rewrite that system.
Keep in mind that inclusion to the legal system doesn't necessarily mean legalizing polymarriage. It could simply mean adding polyamory to the protected status list, as in you can't fire somebody because they're gay or a woman or because of their race. If we could get polyamory added to that list because of their relationship orientation, that would be a legal protection for us. I don't actually know very many people who are actually fighting for multi-person marriage, but it would be nice to have some protections.
Well, the way I look at it is this. One of the tests that I use to figure out whether or not I think bigotry and oppression is happening is if all due legal and social considerations are equally available to everybody concerned. So in other words, if monogamous people have access to a legal institution, i.e. marriage, that nobody else has access to, that's a sign of bigotry. Everybody has equal access to all due social and legal considerations. That doesn't mean you have to take them, right? Just like, although the current president is trying to undermine it, the idea was that regardless of gender or sexual orientation or ethnic background or religion, you can all serve in the military. That doesn't mean you have to. Yeah. It means you can. And in the same way, I think that as a legal social institution, if marriage is going to exist, it ought to be available to everybody. On the other hand, is that the hill that I'm going to die on? No.
Yeah.
I totally support those that are. I'm with you. If that is what fires you up and motivates you and makes you want to get involved, bravissimo. I love you. Go, go, go. Just not my hill.
Yeah, same here. Yeah, I agree. My hill is racial, a hill that I quite literally could die on.
Right.
Oh, goodness.
And mine is, looking for more sex for LustyGuy.
Which is a goal a lot of us should work to achieve. Not for ourselves, but for LustyGuy.
I agree. The world should be my wingman.
You are not allowed to start a cult.
I have too much ethics for a cult, but I thought about it, believe me.
Now, that being said, I like some of these questions that AJ asked at the end, such as, what can the poly community learn from anti-racist and LGBTQ resistance movements? Any thoughts on that?
I think those movements are built on a lot of threats of physical danger. So I'm not sure what kind of analogy we can make in that case.
Well, one thing I think that we can definitely learn is that if you look at the history of those movements, they have never been unified. Mm-hmm. There have always been the Queer Pride Parade and the Log Cabin Republicans. There have always been the Black Panthers and the nonviolence using the Christian church movement within the black community and the civil rights movement. And there has always been tension between those factions. So inasmuch as we have a desire in the poly community to think that we need to all be singing from the same notebook, which I hear a lot, or that we have to police ourselves and make sure that we're creating a unified, acceptable image, that flies in the face of the reality of those movements. Those movements have made the progress they have made while being argumentative, while having different factions that had different approaches, while having radically different ideas of how to do things. And I think that we could learn that from those movements, that it's okay to be different in our approach to politics.
And that sort of thing should come naturally to polyamory just because we're already sort of writing outside of the margins. We're already sort of customizing our own experiences here. We're not reading from a playbook. We're not modeled to from our parents for the most part. Not, some of us are. But I mean,
you would think, but man, we are full of people saying that you're doing it wrong.
Yeah. And the polyamory community is full of people who don't even identify as polyamorous.
Yeah, that's right. That's a very good point.
Kevin, any other thoughts before we wrap this topic up? Is there anything we haven't hit on?
This last question about what is the radical potential of poly loving becoming normal? And that cycles back to the same thing I was saying before. Like, monogamy ends up being such a default setting that people aren't having conversations about what they want out of their relationships. They're going at it in the way of their expectations, as opposed to writing their expectations or discussing what they want out of their relationship and making their choices from there. So to me, that's the radical potential. Just everyone has a chance to write their own story their own way, as opposed to living by societal standard and pop culture narrative.
Just installing the default and going.
Yep. Exactly. And that's kind of where I lie too. I don't think of myself as terribly political, but I would love to see a world where people choose monogamy consciously, yes, and then define what monogamy means to them, or poly, or non-monogamy, or whatever, as opposed to, as you say, being the default. So maybe that's radical enough.
The one last note that I would put expressly for AJ, in as much as any of this has sounded like we are poo-pooing your thoughts or observations or being old and crusty and jaded, I want to make sure that impression doesn't last, and that that, as Kevin and I have both said, we got your back. Whatever it is that you think engages you politically, that you want to go out there and get involved in, hey, we got your back. We're just being old and curmudgeonly. And, it's okay. Don't listen to us too much if you feel like that we were kind of poo-pooing you.
And really, we're having these conversations. We're on a widely available podcast having these conversations. It's awesome that we're having these conversations. The people who sort of came up with our modern take on polyamory back in the 60s or 70s, they weren't having these conversations, not in the way we are. I welcome it. Even if we end up being on different sides of the argument, these are debates and discussions that we need to have.
Hosanna, absolutely.
Hosanna? Really?
Did I say that wrong? Is that right?
Did you mean huzzah?
I don't know what I meant. I meant to say, yes, you're right. It's early. I need to go diving again. I'm thinking about other things now.
So, AJ, thank you so much for asking that question.
Yes.
As we wrap up, Kevin, tell everybody where to find you.
Online, I am Poly Role Models on Facebook, at Poly Role Models on Twitter, on Instagram. My blog is focused at polyrolemodels.tumblr.com. If you'd like to support inclusive representation of polyamory, you can find me at patreon.com/polyrolemodels. And in Meat Space, I'm going to be at CatalystCon the weekend of September 15th in Los Angeles, speaking about race and polyamory and about sex-positive parenting.
Oh, cool. I miss CatalystCon. I just haven't had the resources to go for a while. My bandwidth is just too low. Have fun. I always love CatalystCon. Awesome. Yeah. Well, that being said, thanks to Kevin and LustyGuy for co-hosting. Thanks to our playmates for donating and subscribing and helping support the podcast. We are a free resource. We've helped hundreds of thousands of people navigate their introduction to and success with polyamory. Your donations, including writing in questions like this, help keep the podcast free and awesome for everybody, both inside and outside the community. If you have questions, comments, or feedback, call 802-505-POLY. Email polyweekly@gmail.com. If you'd like to book us to speak at your event or basically have anything business related for Polyweekly, that email goes to LustyGuy@polyweekly.com, who actually typically responds within 48 hours, as opposed to 48 days, like me.
I'm kind of on a bad string right now for this week, but I'll get better.
Thanks, Kevin, for joining us. Thanks to everyone for listening. And remember,
it's not all about the sex.